of course. Yeah.
All sorted. Good.
Okay.
We're going. So good to finally meet you here. It's been, as I was just saying offline, it's like I've been following your writing for a good few months now, and just really happy with watching this expression unfold and your journey and your path, and feeling very seen or heard or understood, or like there's a resonance there that I feel in your words where you seem to capture the nuance of a situation in a really embodied way. So the words feel like they're coming from the body with, a really sharp articulation rather than just from like a concept land. Like I really feel like the depth in them, that's able to hold a lot of different points that seem to be maybe contrasting or conflicting in some way. And you articulate it so well, in my opinion. I find it fantastic. So yeah,
You.
I've been a little bit of a fanboy of your work for a while now. So I would love to hear from you a little bit about your journey, like how you got into this stuff, how you ended up where you are now doing what you're doing, and then we can get stuck into it a little bit.
Okay, cool. Yeah, introductions are my favorite.
Who are you? Tell us in words.
No, it's good. It's good practice. It's good practice. Yeah. So I'm Rae. I'm a teacher. And I think I knew probably from quite a young age. In fact, as soon as I say that, I remember various occasions when I was really quite young, actually, of people saying, "Oh, you'd be a really good teacher." And at the time, I assumed that would be that I would teach in schools or something like that. I didn't have any special desire to be a teacher or to be a school teacher. I was actually raised primarily by two school teachers. My mother's a TA. My stepfather was a maths teacher who went on to be like deputy head kind of positions and stuff like that. So yeah, now I'm saying it out loud. There's definitely something in that. I didn't. I didn't think I would be a spiritual teacher. I kind of feel like I was thinking this recently over the last couple of weeks. Like sometimes I feel like one of those blokes out on the streets doing like the religious preaching, and they're just talking about things. And I don't generally stop to listen to them. I don't really know what they're saying a lot of the time. But what I get this sense, and I also don't preach religion. Let's just make that very, very clear. But there's this sense that what has brought them out there to speak to people is like this, like I found something here. I found something here and I want to share it with people and I want people to know about it. And I want to be able to facilitate a process where people can have that experience for themselves. So it's different. It's different to preaching, when I really chew on it. There are core differences here, but I just, in a light-hearted way, and perhaps sometimes, if I'm really honest with myself, in a occasionally disheartening way. Sometimes I feel like that crazy person out on the streets, but I'm like, look, I found something here. Like I want people to know about it, and that's why I'm a teacher. And I also mentor people. I've spent the last few years working with groups primarily, exploring a specific frequency through a spiritual lens. So I bring groups together and create experiences. I started out as a yoga teacher. That was like the first stepping stone onto the path. That quickly branched out. As soon as I qualified as a yoga teacher and I started teaching in the UK, like something unraveled quite quickly. And I want to be really careful with how I say this, because it's not that I don't have reverence and appreciation for that starting point. it was also that I very quickly hit a point there where I didn't feel as though I could go any further on account of some of the dogma, and just on account of like westernized yoga, and let's just be honest, the lack of depth that a lot of those practices actually have, because they've been taken. So yeah, there came a point where I branched out. I qualified. I studied yoga therapy and started practicing as a somatic therapist. And then
as a what? Sorry,
somatic
oh,
therapy.
somatic. Okay, all right.
But that's been, I think that's been really, that's really deeply ingrained into everything, is the somatic piece, because that was such an important piece for me. I came to yoga because I just couldn't feel myself, and was doing all kinds of funky and destructive things in an attempt to try and feel myself.
Yeah.
So yoga was the beginning of actually starting to feel things on an embodied level. Yeah, so from somatic therapy then came 2020, and my in-person business ceased to exist very quickly. And I had been talking for a while about taking things online and starting to branch out a bit, and starting to, do coaching, for lack of a better word. And then, in came the circumstances that would just give me a very swift kick into doing that. And that's kind of where I've been since. It's just been deepening from there, really.
Oh, amazing. It's when you said both your parents were teachers, that's very, it gave me a little light bulb. Both my parents are teachers as well. So there's some kind of teacher resonance, I feel, within that, or what it gives you in terms of a kind of a lineage to follow. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think the yoga part, the body part, it sounds like you were searching for, you had this kind of, I think you describe it in one of your articles like dissociation, which I think is a very common experience for people, where there's just like this gap in the middle. It's like I'm here, but I'm not quite here. And where am I? And how do I pull all of these pieces back together? And so there's a part of you that then goes off to seek certain things. And okay, starts with this, or this feels luminous, I'll follow this path. And then you start to piece it together. But then it sounds like you noticed the limitations within that one specific system, the discipline of yoga, which kind of makes sense, to be honest, because that particular system arose from a land that is not necessarily like a native land. So I think the westernization of yoga has it's like it's borrowing an embodiment practice from another land. I'm not, I guess I don't have strong opinions on kind of cultural appropriation or things like that, but it's like there is something that I think we like mix and match things, but to try to, it sounds like you're trying to find something from other places, which I can really resonate with, to be able to get in touch, like move from this conceptual thing of who you are down into who you actually are as this living, breathing, vibrating, ever-changing, evolving being.
Right. And I wrote a while ago, and it wasn't, I knew as I was writing it, I was like, oh, some people are not going to like this. But I spoke about how westernized yoga is a kind of spiritual infancy, and a very, and for that way that the West has borrowed practices from the East, in a way it's been like a really essential part of the collective awakening process. And then there comes a point where you have to acknowledge that borrowing was only ever going to direct you back to yourself and your own channel.
Yeah, for sure.
And if you kind of cling to it, and you actually, there comes a point where you're holding yourself apart from that deeper realization. And from the this synthesizing, is that the word, of your own like medicine and what you're actually here to bring.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I find the borrowing, like it seems like we've arrived at this point in time in history now where people are moving around a lot and getting influenced by different cultures and learning about each other in different cultures in a way that wasn't maybe previously as easily accessible before. And so, for myself, I lived in Asia for the best part of about 15 years. Like I was there for a long time and got into Eastern practices and Vipassana and things like that. And I really found that there's such value in those practices, but it still wasn't quite the completion. Like it wasn't like the completion of my own kind of root expression or embodiment or something like that. But it does strike me as with the different people moving around and different influences and access to different cultures, there is this, it's almost like different parts of the brain communicating with one another. Take like a global scale, and we're trying to understand and like, okay, well, this is over here, and if we pull a little bit of that from over there, and that feels like a very like an organic earth process somehow. But to get bogged down in the idea of, like, I love how you talk a lot about identity is like a concept. The concept of yourself is not who you are ultimately, and that I think really speaks true to me. In that sense, it's like if you get caught in the idea of yourself, I'm a yoga teacher, I am this, I am that, then it starts to it doesn't give you what you need. It's not as nourishing as something that comes really from that deep internal space.
Totally. You deny yourself the opportunity to directly experience that by clinging onto the identity, and that actually quite neatly encapsulates the reason why I stepped away from yoga and why it is like an essential place along the process, but it's not the place you necessarily stay. And it, that's not to deny that perhaps there are people that have that practice opens up the direct experience for them, and then it continues to be true for them to continue practicing and teaching yoga. I'm not saying that it's that what I experienced here is necessarily the case for everyone, but I think that it is more often than not the case.
I feel like what you said there could be applied to like everything and should be. It's like, this was my experience of it. This is the right path for me. It doesn't mean that it should be a blanket for everybody across the board. I think the first piece that I read by you was your evolving thoughts on gender identity, and that's what really like hooked me into this perspective on. Or it was something that really captured the nuance of your personal experience with gender identity, and I just felt you were so well able to capture all of the different threads of how you'd experienced it without pushing it onto you should think about it like this or you should be this or that. It was like, here's how you experienced it, and it felt like it really led people. I mean, I say that, I'll speak for myself. It led me at least through this experience of what it was like for you going through this kind of gender identity thing, but then not getting attached to the labels, which has been been thinking about this a lot lately, and the symptoms of diagnosis culture, like this obsession to try to cling to an identity, whether it's a gender identity or like a mental illness or something like that, as a like a box to say I am this thing. So yeah, curious to hear what you got to say about the whole gender identity thing and the journey with that.
Yeah, I was really, that initial piece, when I shared it on Substack, which I think is where you saw it, I had written that I think maybe a year before and shared it, and just on Instagram. I wasn't really using Substack at the time, so most of my writing was on Instagram, and I remember having a lot of trepidation and was then really, really surprised by the response from just people, you know, regardless of whether they identified as non-binary or trans or not. There was a very one of the key responses was like this, this has really like allowed me to just explore more deeply my own thoughts about this and my own relationship to this. Like I was really, really expecting pushback, and I was really surprised by the response. You know, like at this present moment, like at this point in time, I have really been moving towards, because it was such an important thing for me to be able to articulate and to be able to break down, and it felt so important as well to be able to share it where other people could see it, so that they could actually take the threads and see to what extent it applied to their own experience. Because I really do believe that gender non-conformity is, what do I believe? Because I'm not even sure if I can really encapsulate this in like one or two sentences, because I just feel like it's so complex, and it depends on so many things and so many experiences. But I think one of the core sentiments that there can be a lot of pushback against is like this idea that it has something to do with a trauma response, or it has something to do with trauma. Trauma is such an overused word as well. So I'm very conscious of the way that word and that whole discussion has been diluted. And I spent a lot of years, especially while I was teaching yoga, very immersed in trauma, and specifically complex trauma, and how it presents and the neurophysiology of it. Like, this was a huge piece for me that I went into quite a lot of depth on, which has really, really informed, you know, the thoughts that I have about it now, alongside my own direct experience of having a fracture that I wasn't trying to heal. Like, I wasn't trying to work on it or like heal it or something. It spontaneously closed, and there was like a greater sense of wholeness that came in through a sequence of experiences that I was having. And then that need to identify as non-binary literally just dropped out of the bottom. And I'm not saying that it has to be everyone's experience, but I think it would be absurd not to assume that it's an experience that is shared significantly. And I can only really speak for like women, and the renunciation of womanhood that can happen as a result of traumatic fractures. And I don't have a story for the fracture. It's not like something acute happened and then there was a fracture, although there might have been, and perhaps I don't remember, or whatever else. I don't actually have a specific mental story for that. I don't know what will have initially caused the fracture, so to speak. It was just there until it wasn't anymore.
Yeah. I think what you're saying there as well, and this can be something that people can get muddled up in, and certainly been in that pit myself, is like equating fractures and trauma with wrongness and shame and all of this. And it's like,
so that's it. If I say it, people are like, oh, so you're saying that there's something wrong with me and there's something wrong that I identify. So no, not in the slightest. And that can really, you know, the response can be really aggressive there, because there's like a big like protective thing that comes up there, and it bares its teeth and it snarls and it growls, because it's like, and I get it. I get why the protection is there, but there's no connection that needs to be made between the presence of a traumatic fracture and wrongness. But then I completely understand why those wires get crossed, because one of the core identity structures that often gets formed around a traumatic fracture is I am wrong. Is the
Yeah.
core of me is wrong.
A kind of
I'm not
shame story.
qualified. So it's like when I point to it being a trauma related thing, that's the thing that gets hit, is that really tender place underneath the identity structure that is like, I'm wrong, there's something wrong with me. Because that's what trauma does, is it disrupts your sense of rightness.
Wow. I love that. Yeah. It feels like it in lots of ways when people have that sense of wrongness, that, you know, that shame story of wrongness, that's like something happened, I am not whole, I'm not complete, there's something wrong with me, then there is that survival stress that scrabbles to try to put a box around it. Like, what am I? I need a structure to put my identity in, because my identity just as a living, breathing being is not enough per se. Like, there's a lack, there's a scarcity or something in that.
Mm, mm. And I kind of had an image then, as you were talking, of like all of the boxes just at the level of like the head, just around the neck. But then there's like, if you go beneath the boxes, then there's like a swirling mass of a kind of gaseous substance. And it's like we live up in all of these boxes to avoid that swirling mass beneath that actually contains our life force and our creative power. And it's just being kind of locked up there because there's pain there too. And it's like anything to avoid. This is one of like this is one of those things. And the more I go into it, the more I'm like, oh man, like if only we all knew. And I say if only we all knew because there are still places where I forget, right? Or rather, I don't forget these days. I would say it's more that just the ingrained response is so strong to like do anything to avoid the feeling.
Yeah.
And when you actually go into the felt senses and the feelings that just got locked up from a time where you literally perhaps didn't have the capacity to feel them, you're too small. It's so much more preferable to let that loose and let that through. Genuinely preferable, genuinely easier. It's not without pain, but genuinely easier to just directly experience what has been locked up down there than it is to stay in these boxes up here.
Yeah. It doesn't always feel that way for people, does it? It's like,
No.
because they're wired over time, like kind of myelinated to think, well, this is the way I've always done it, so I'll just stay with this track. This feeling is something I need to avoid the whole time. But actually, the power and the key and is going towards it and going into it, and like you say, like stepping into it without words. Like you're not wording your experience. You're not trying to structure your experience linguistically as you're having it. You can just have the experience and let it reverberate, and then allow a linguistic structure to emerge from the center of the experience, rather than trying to top down, put it into a box kind of thing. And yeah, the trauma and wrongness association and link, it really strikes me that it's very difficult to separate trauma from growth. Like, because growth is that stretching out into the unknown, like into things that are uncomfortable and unknown, and then settling through and into it and allowing that to, like, it's like an expansion of your being. So there's a traumatic rupture, maybe, or something that happened, like you say, when you were young, and there's you didn't have the capacity to fully process and integrate that and let it move through the body to create like part of the identity structure that can handle things like that when they come up in the future.
Yeah.
So doing this work when you're older now, to be able to sit back into those feelings and turn what has been post-traumatic stress into post-traumatic growth and like expand your identity, it really, I find it difficult to conceive of how you can grow without what we would call trauma, which might just be a word for intensity. I suppose it becomes trauma when it does get stuck, like when it gets repressed and pushed down, and then you would maybe label it as trauma. But in general, it's like an experience that's too intense for a system that might be too small to be able to handle it at the time. And then in later life, that's when the capacity is bigger. There can be an unpacking of that.
Yeah. Like it's worth noting that it is possible to live continuously in a state of being where life, no matter how intense or difficult or challenging, can actually just pass straight through you. And that's the ultimate state as far as I'm concerned. That's what I'm focused on.
Yeah, that's very powerful. And I think it's like personally empowering. So this is another part of your work that I was really fascinated by and felt a very strong resonance with, is you describe it, I think, as the intersection between politics and personal power. I can't remember where you wrote this, but I remember reading it somewhere in your work. And that, I find that really, really fascinating, because I can see how politically people's focus and attention is drawn so far outside of themselves that they neglect what's actually in the body, like these internal resources that they can tap to make what's happening out there kind of not strictly irrelevant, but just to be able to perceive it in a completely different way in which they're able to have power with the situation rather than feeling victimized by it, which was another one article I was scanning over this morning of yours, the kink for victimhood, I think it was called. And this is just, there's so much nuance in what you talk about. It's like, it's not this binary thing, which I think comes with when you have like the depth of a well-regulated nervous system. You actually can perceive things in the kind of nuance that maps onto reality sufficiently. Whereas when you are still fighting with a lot of those kind of trauma responses, when that stuff hasn't been as investigated, then it tends to put the world in that survival stress, black or white binary thinking. But yeah, politics and personal power and that intersection I find fascinating, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, like this is one of those things where it's almost a bit paradoxical to sit with, because on one hand I feel like I've landed on a lot of clarity around this, and it is also something, it's a thread that I'm kind of following in complete pitch black, as in I don't have finite answers for what I propose when speaking to that intersection. Like what does the world look like when we have given up this fucking left right extremity circus? Like, what does that actually look like? But what I know to be true in myself is that there is a very, very stark reflection in that extremity outside, as it pertains to the division that exists inside every person.
Yeah, for sure.
And there was something else in what you were saying then. I think it was, yeah, right. So just to touch on the feeling that the victimhood piece, I've just lost my thread. What was I going to say about the victimhood piece? That's it, right? So I've just had another, and I think the I'm so on this, and I'm like, where are the words? People do not realize how how radically responsible we all are individually and collectively for everything, every single thing that we see in the world. Mm-hmm. If you can see it, you are a part of a collective ecosystem that is contributing towards the creation of it. So it's like when people are out there and they're like, you're part of the problem. And I think I even said that. I said, I don't love saying that, but you know, when it's done in that, it's done from that energy of I'm on the good side, right? You're a part of the problem. You're on the bad side. And it's like, no, babe, you can see it. You're part of the same problem that everyone else is a part of. I don't love calling it a problem. I think there are better words here. But that level, like having that, what we're all really being called into. And this is where I sometimes feel like a crazy religious preacher on the streets, because people fucking hate it. Is the truth that you're responsible for everything. You're responsible for all of your creations, and you're responsible for everything that you see. And look, I will bring in some nuance here as well, because I believe this with an enormous amount of intensity and rigor, and also in spiritual circles and in spiritual communities. A thing that I've noticed is that notion of responsibility, of personal responsibility, can become a whip. Yeah. So it's become a way that we use the quote unquote work to hurt ourselves. You know, like I've been in front of people who are like talking about personal responsibility, and you can see they're just being really, really hard on themselves. So I really, really want to like shine a light on that, because that is so important. It's like, it is important that, yes, we are responsible for everything that we see, and we create something new individually and collectively when we really grok that. But also that cannot become a way that we punish ourselves, because true responsibility cannot exist without unconditional self-compassion.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's a lovely way to think about it. It strikes me as very true as well.
It's so loving.
Yeah. The responsibility, there's a prepositional shift. Responsible for and responsible to, I find, is much more like present future oriented, and I love that little tiny shift. It's like, and also the responsibility piece, it can easily get subverted into the shame story again, you know, therefore I'm bad, therefore I'm wrong. It's like responsibility and blame shame paradigms are two different things. Like, you might be responsible to something, responsible maybe for it, but blame and shame and wrongness you can separate that out, but they're very enmeshed. Like, they can get very, very enmeshed, and it's like, oh, I'm so bad, which then creates this collapse, this powerlessness. And no, that's not what responsibility is. Responsibility is like an invitation to power in some sense. It's like you can do something, even. And that is something along the lines of spending time within this unconditional compassion, your inner world, to allow it to self-organize, to reorganize in a way that aligns so that power can actually move through you, rather than whipping yourself with the shame stick and saying, you're responsible for this because you're bad. and wrong and terrible. That's more trauma kind of finding its way through that structure to express itself in some way, it appears.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's something in that if you can resolve to play with it. So like what you said about the trauma finding a way through the structure, it's like because I believe that we become truly skilled creators when we can separate blame, shame, wrongness from responsibility. When those things aren't enmeshed anymore and tangled up with one another, you can really start to realize yourself in a whole new way. So when it does come up, it's like, oh, okay, like there it is. There's and beneath that, then if you can actually, and the practice is like you drop beneath that sediment layer of story that's like, oh, I'm wrong, I'm shit, or whatever. You drop beneath that and actually go into the gaseous mass that I was referring to beneath it, and let that through, break open the sediment, let it through to leave. And then there's a wellspring of power that gets free from there. And the story has no hold anymore there. You don't even, I think one of the, and this is something that I spent a lot of time in, agonizingly, is like trying to, being hyper self-aware of all of the narratives that I was running, and then trying to resolve and fix those narratives on the same plane. And then really learning beyond that to drop deeper than the sediment.
Yeah, you got to get beneath the structure.
Yeah. And you can spend your whole life up there in that structure. But and that's the point, is it is a structure in a way. And it's a structure that can't build anything new. Like it's a structure that only knows what it already knows based upon its past experiences. So the point is, when you can drop beneath it into the formless stuff and the structure breaks down, a new structure can be built. And when we build new structures inside, we are then capable of building new structures outside. Like that is so key.
Yeah, for sure. It's like what you're saying, it kind of strikes me, the idea of the structure up here is built on a foundation that's fundamentally not solid in a way. It's too amorphous, it's too kind of chaotic. You know, before you've done this kind of work, the chaos is just there on a kind of vibratory level, pulling you in all different directions. So the structure that you've built might prevent you from seeing it, but it's like, you know, building a house on the sand or something. It's always going to be shifting underneath. And in some sense it is anyway. Yeah. But the more you descend into that, the more you can start to feel, okay, I have a level of solidarity with this ever-changing thing, and I'm starting to identify with this ever-changing thing. So I'm not, like, my identity has depth. And this is what really gets me to think about the left-right extremes and the polarity and the identity. It's like the polarity is almost like black holes that we get sucked to one side or the other, and there tends to be a strong identitarian structure at either one side or the other, and then that projects. It's like they create each other. I've really been fascinated by these ideas of how we're constantly creating each other through our judgments, and then creating ourselves, like structuring ourselves through our judgments and structuring other people through them, and how we respond to them has a, like, there's no, in this like ever changing interconnectedness, wavy, amorphous, like vibrating, living, breathing, screaming, shitting mass of human nature and life. It's like we're constantly just up here with these little structures saying this is this and this is this, desperately trying to avoid the terror of the depth of what's actually going on. But it's by descending into the terror and the depth of what's going on as it manifests through the structure of your own body that you can start to feel an identity that's actually tethered and rooted and grounded, rather than being something that's just conceptual.
Yeah, yeah. And that's when I'm just getting this image coming up over and again. It's like that's when you become able to build a structure that actually houses the depth, rather than you stuff the depth down and pretend it's not there, and then it rumbles underneath the shaky foundations of this like pitiful identity structure that you've built atop it to try and avoid going down there.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is like the lane switch, essentially, from that to actually being a creator, is letting that thing up and through, and then being able to build something around it that's constantly subject to change. Like, I think, like I wrote recently that we've kind of got it upside down. Like, we've got so many things upside down, right? We have this like very shaky connection to our core, and to that root that exists in the amorphous mass, as you put it. But so we seek to fix identity in place. That's the thing that we fix in place. Whereas identity actually gets to be this fluid thing. And then it's the connection to the center that is fixed. And it's never not, you're never not connected. It's just that you don't go down there enough to directly experience the fullness of that connection, and the way in which it can feed you, and the way in which it fills you up on the inside, in a way where then you don't actually crave for anything outside of you. This is where I'm really this is like really the body of work that I'm bringing through right now. And also, the thing that I am embodying more deeply is like is fortifying the connection to that thing, so that you just become so full and so satiated, so unshakably connected, that those places where you grab at the air for something to validate your existence, or you those places where you long for something in a really painful way because you feel as though something in you is lacking, and that thing will fill the void. It's like that just isn't a thing anymore. And I don't like talking about stuff like this in a way where it's like, yes, you'll stop experiencing that thing that's painful, because like, I don't know if you ever completely eradicate anything, but I actually do believe that, I was talking just now about that, being in that state where life just passes through so that things don't get stuck. Trauma you don't have post-traumatic stress because things just pass through. And I don't know if I like post-traumatic stress as the word that I want to use there, or the phrase that I want to use, because that's not to, undermine really like acutely intense things that might happen, but more just like life in its day-to-day process isn't constantly hitting you, and you're not constantly holding on to hard conversations or things that activated you. It's like things just really are allowed to pass through. Like, I believe that's what we're all actually being called towards on some level, is a connection to that thing that is so incomparable. Like it just can't be shaken, that you're full. And then that overflow is what creates the world.
Yeah, that's very powerful. Thinking about it and listening to you speak about it's almost like a drop into the middle, from this, which is very concerned with right and wrong, and very binary, polar opposites of this is always right and this is always wrong, which the more I've like descended through my own tunnels and into the darkness and into the like the unknown, or the like the jungle of my own body, you start to arrive. I felt like I've started to arrive at this place which is deeply rooted to the center, even though I still freak out often. But it's like there's something I can feel. There's something there that's constantly. It's much more radial in its felt sense. It's not as much directional. It's more kind of radial, and it's like the kind of the beating heart is just constantly going from the middle outwards, and you're more dropping into this type of awareness of what's needed now. Not what's morally right or morally wrong. It's kind of beyond moralistic structures in some ways. It's like I'm listening to the depth of what's needed for the self, and then the extension of the self, which is the environment and other selves as one self. And you're just listening and feeling to that kind of life moving through you and telling you to go this way, go this way, go this way. And that is a very it can be very anxiety provoking sometimes, because it's like, well, I like my plan, I like my set structure, and this is going to happen at this time, and there's a security in that. And it also doesn't negate, I think, the necessity in some senses to have an itinerary that actually, at least inspires some kind of action. Okay, I'm going to set my itinerary, I'm going to set my goal and my move towards, and try to plan things out. And there is some value in having that structural approach, but ultimately it needs to be flexible. Like, it needs to be adaptable, and it needs to kind of move and flex with life as it kind of radiates out from you. And the more deeply you're connected to that internal compass and guidance, and listening to the body and the feelings from the body, which are representative of the needs, without being tyrannized by the feelings at the same time, which I can see often. Like when I went really deep into this, and I could feel like, I can't do this today, or I can't do this today. Like the feelings became too strong and overwhelming, which is where that structural, I guess you would call it, that masculine itinerary is like, no, you need to go to the gym today. That's what's needed, even if it doesn't feel good. Or you need to go and get in the sea, or you need to do this. It doesn't always feel good. Like, it's not necessarily about that, but it somehow feels true, or somehow feels aligned. Like there's an integrity to it, integratedness to it, on a larger wavelength, as well as these kind of smaller day-to-day fluctuations.
Yeah. And that, that having that discernment, I think, is so key to like being a practitioner of a spiritual path. I remember, looking back, maybe like a small handful of years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, I had a very kind of rigid, disciplined practice that I never really stuck to, and then I'd be really awful to myself about the fact that I wasn't sticking to it. And that was the way that my own pendulum would swing from one to the other, between like this really militant box ticking thing to just collapse, and then the old habits, the habits that I was trying to get a handle on, would come back in from there. And there is something that happens beyond that I feel like you were alluding to just then. So what drops in for me when I consider the thing that happens is like that pendulum swinging it's born out of the avoidance of feeling those sensations. So it's like, if I can just be militant enough and meticulous enough, I won't have to feel what's lurking under there. And then beyond that, when you start to grow the capacity to feel, and when there starts to be more acceptance around the shifts in energy and that constant undulating of sensation and the movement of energy, what then comes in is on those days where those movements are feeling, like a lot, what there is a more, how would I describe it? A more supportive, kind but firm masculine presence that's like, okay, we're in our feelings. So it is going to serve to go get in the sea, go do some exercise, take your fucking vitamins, get some rest. Whatever it is, just go do it. There's like, you can feel like the energy around that is like, it's different.
Yeah. It is. It's like it's come from love rather than fear. It feels like that anyways. There's a warmth to it. There's a texture of like, yeah, it's solid, but it's warm. It's not this cold, do it or else. It's more like, yeah, do it because. It's a move towards rather than a move away from.
Yeah. Move towards rather than move away from. I think that's actually really the key piece in that, is that we do so much of what we do without realizing can be in an attempt to move away from. Often our desire for more, I've been chewing on this recently with a view to write about it, like our desire for more is often born out of a desire to feel less. Whereas the, we'll call it new paradigm growth, is you receive and you hold and you create more by feeling more. So we have a lot of the structures that we have in place outside of us are currently there because we moved towards growth from a place of feeling less. The coveting of false power, I'll say false power because there is true power, and this is a big problem in the political, realm as well, is that people view power, especially I think in the left, they view power as this inherently shit thing that you want to avoid at all costs, because look at all of those big mad men wanting their power with their power, and actually there's an essential discernment that needs to be made between what is false power, what is true power. People covet false power out of a desire to not feel. And then that all that stuff that goes unfelt busts out sideways in really strange and harmful and often quite fucking horrific ways. That's why we see what we see. And that is why we are all responsible for it, because we all have that. We all have that tendency. And awakening is that capacity to create more by feeling more.
Yeah, 100%. This is also interesting, the idea of the left kind of admonishing power in that regard, but at the same time, I feel like there's an undercurrent of seeking it, like a deep, like there's totally. A rejection,
and
but
it's totally repressed and disowned. That's it. It's like when people say, and again, I don't like to drag the left, but it's a very kind of leftist sentiment, like, I hate money, money's evil. And it's like, no, you really covet it, and you're just in denial about the fact of how much you covet it. If you say you hate money, you're saying you hate yourself.
Oh, interesting.
You say you hate anything, you're saying you hate yourself.
Yeah, concur. So there's this idea then, from what you talked about then, of you've got this thing that you hate, and this like threads into some stuff that I've been was mapping out last year. You've got this thing that you hate, and then you have the move away from that thing, which forces an adaptation or a development which arrives you at this point over here. So now I've moved away from the thing that I hate, and now I'm over here, but I'm also here as well. Like I can't really move away from it. So I've got this tension now between these 2 points, the thing that I hate and that I've been avoiding, and the thing that I've actually developed in order to like try to circumnavigate this thing that I'm hate and avoiding. And there's a tension between those 2 points, and the thing that gets created goes this way. It kind of comes out from the middle of that, rather than, you're just stretching tension between those 2 things. And there isn't, and I think when there's a recognition of that, I am I don't want to think that I'm the thing that I hate, but I am. And there's this pendulum that tries to go, well, am I the thing that I love that I've developed, or am I the thing that I hate and it's like, well, actually you're both. The recognition, the synthesis of that, I'm just fumbling with my mic here because I'm so excited, but it's like the synthesis of those 2 things creates a directionality where something completely new emerges sideways. And when you synthesize those 2 things, it's like, well, yeah, you've still got the skills that you developed from that thing. You've also got the empathy and connection with the thing once you integrate it. Like, so other people who are at that place, you have this paradigm where you can kind of teach them to get out of it, but not because they're escaping it, but because you're going in a different trajectory now. And I feel like that's a really important part of the creation process, is like these 2 things come together and the other thing comes out that way. And it's like, I mean, you symbolically in the world, that's like masculine, feminine coming together, and the thing, out comes the new creation from that.
Yeah. I really that the way that you have given an image to that, or like a diagram to that, really makes sense to me. It really lands. Yeah.
It's I feel like the concepts can be difficult to grasp sometimes, but imagery, pictures, light, images of light hold sound like thousands of words at the same time. So there's a way, if you can capture it in symbols, which is what's been interesting about last year, to look at a lot of these older symbols and see how you can map concepts onto those symbols, and you can use them as almost like ways to simplify all of the concepts that are floating around in the mind that might have kind of come from the body, but it can be difficult sometimes to like pull the right concept at the right time. But if there's a bit of a symbology for it, then it makes it a bit easier it lodges in the psyche a little bit better, so you can use it.
That really, what that raises for me is how one of the reasons why we are so polarized and divided is because there has been like a big divorce from symbolism, from the way that we pay attention to it and have reverence for symbolism in all of the ways. In fact, it reminds me, and I don't quite remember what it was called, but I just remember reading something recently about that, like there was a word for it. It was basically tearing down magical thinking, and there is some nuance here, right? Because there is a way that magical thinking can actually be delusional.
No,
but
sure.
there is something in the way, because we've become so logical, we've become so reliant upon logic, that we've internalized a tendency to gaslight ourselves when we do see patterns and symbols that are actually very valid and bring a lot of wisdom, could bring a lot of wisdom to the way that we metabolize our experiences. Like that hyperlogical tendency completely flattens the creative flow of symbolism. People don't pay attention to their dreams, right? Virtually every conversation I have with people about dreams, and I have a couple of like besties who I can talk about my dreams with, and I love that so much, because I did not have that for a long while, because most of the people that I encounter are like, yeah, dreams are meaningless. And I'm like, bro, like they're not. Like you are in denial of a whole ocean of stuff.
Yeah. It's like information. I so relate to this and the symbolic world as presented to you in dreams. It's like, because you're using the logical framework to try to interpret your dreams, and it's like, that's not what dreams are. It's like, yeah, the horse can talk. It's like, it's nonsense, because it doesn't fit into my pre-existing logical framework of what should and shouldn't be. You know, my judgments, which I think are kind of synonymous with I guess like a patriarchal thinking, like a pattern-based logical thinking, patriarchy, all of this stuff. And but that's not what the dream world is. The dream world is the descent into the underworld, like descent into the pure experience of the body. It's like when you go to sleep, a part of your brain goes to sleep, which might be the prefrontal cortex, and the other part wakes up, which is this deeply symbolic, interpretive thing where the body just speaks to you through images of light and symbols, which you can then utilize if you can extract the information from. There's so much depth in the information that's coming from there, because it's just coming straight from the body. It's like coming straight from nature, this self-organizing intelligence that you have a little patch of to deal with for tens of years. And it's like that information coming from there that's represented symbolically in dreams can help align you with the larger currents of nature, and to just dismiss it because it doesn't fit your map. Like, we have this expression in NLP that the map is not the territory, and it's like we're lost in the map. Like, the map is the logical thing, but suddenly you get to a place in the map where the map doesn't cover this area.
Yeah.
Like, you've been on Google Maps and it's like, I'm not driving down that road. It's barely a road. It's got holes in it, and there's just, all kinds of mad stuff. So you need to really drop into that symbolic realm. And I feel like there's so much archetypal literature that points to these things as well. Descend into the belly of the whale to, retrieve parts of yourself, or the Iron John going to the bottom of the lake to find the wild man. I mean, I think that there's equivalents for like the wild woman as well. And then still on the Knights of the Round Table, go into the forest at the place that looks darkest to you. All of that speaks to this idea of sleep, like going into the unconsciousness. Sleep is the unconsciousness, and letting the unconsciousness speak to you symbolically in a way that can actually guide you into a further and deeper alignment with who you are as a depth identity, and what you're here to do as that depth identity.
You have to want it, though. And I think that's the thing. Like I was saying at the beginning, I admitted that, occasionally there is a disheartened feeling that I have. And that comes from the part of me that has wanted more for others and the world than they are actually ready to even begin desiring for themselves. Like, I've definitely had that thing, and that is why perhaps sometimes I feel like the crazy religious preacher on the street. But you have to want it, and I think the common argument is like that, well, it's just processing stuff from the day. And yeah, there is a layer of dream realm that is just processing stuff from the day, but then you go through that layer and you start to access deeper layers. But you have to want to access those deeper layers. There has to be a genuine curiosity. There has to be something in you that's like, yes, okay, like I want to see this. It's easy to say dreams are meaningless because it will satisfy the parts of a person that are quite content with not seeing. You have to want it. You have to want it. Like I went to bed last night and I had just landed on something, an identity actually that's been really long standing, that has just been straggling, and I just couldn't quite see it. And then I had a reflection and I saw it and I was like, okay. So just before I went to sleep, I was like, can I have some dreams? Can I have some dreams where we can actually just go into this, because it's quite deep. And all you have to do is ask. And I don't know whether I take this for granted, because I've lucid dreamed ever since I can remember, and that whole world has been very alive for me ever since I can remember. But I do believe that regardless of what your history is with dreaming and how vivid it is, all you need to do is ask. And that transfers into the way that you converse with life in general, into the way that you talk to what you might call God, just that internal conversation that you have. All you need to do is ask a question and you can receive an answer.
Yeah, but you have to want to ask the question, which is what you're saying, right?
Ask the question. Yeah.
And typically people will ask it when things get painful enough for them. And that's what I find. It's like pain can be a great motivator, but when there's a layer of numbness around the pain and distraction, it's like, well, it's very easy now to not feel the pain because you just go on Instagram for like 20 hours or whatever. Or there's just so many ways to avoid the pain. And if you were to take that away, suddenly you'd be left with this pain, and then that pain would inspire you to want to ask for, well, what's the way through this, because I can't avoid it so much now. So I feel like it's so powerful to be able to sit with your feelings for long enough for like some genuine direction to want to arise from that, or some genuine insight to want to arise from that. It's interesting you say that you lucid dreamed. I had that also for myself. Like I really found lucid dreaming came very naturally to me. I wasn't like trying to do it, but it's always has been something in my life. And then I started to cultivate it before. I don't have it as much now. It feels like I'm moving more into, I suppose, like a less of that. But I did figure out a way to cultivate it that seemed to work well for me, which was if I would fast mostly for the day before, so the body was kind of lighter and had more energy. I'd meditate before I go to sleep. Like I do that pretty much every night anyway. Then I would wake up about 4 a.m. and meditate again until I started to fall asleep. And then I would put my head between 2 pillows so it was black and it was quiet, and I would just let myself drift off into like a third REM cycle, a third sleep cycle. And that tended to be where I would get the deeper dreams from, you know, when my body's kind of used to sleeping deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's when you can start to find some really powerful insights from the dreams and start to play around and wake up in the dream and then organize the dream in a way that you can facilitate some unconscious shifts, which is, I mean, I know it's not, I don't want to say like it's not available to everybody because I don't honestly know, but I know a lot of people haven't strictly had that exact experience.
And don't remember dreams. Like what you were saying about going back to sleep in the early hours, like I find in the final cycle, that's where things are the most vivid, or I'm the most likely to remember dreams or go completely lucid in dreams. I mean, I believe that all of it is really available to every single person. Like we all have varying levels of dormancy and sensitivity that we literally come into the world with varying levels of dormancy and sensitivity, with certain like perceptive abilities, but all of it is available to everyone. And that actually just brings me on to something that was coming up as you were talking just before the dream piece. It's like with answering the question and actually having to want to ask the question, there also has to be an acknowledgement that you have access to the wisdom. And it's not that, because I'm still teasing out layers, right, of identities that feel separate, right? Last night when I'm talking about landing on this identity structure, it was just another structure that believed itself to be separate from everything. So there's like it gets really subtle, like the layer peeling process gets really subtle, but there is a basic acknowledgement. There needs to be a basic acknowledgement that I do have access. There is a connection here. I think that perhaps we can be quite afraid of asking the question if we don't feel like there is a connection to something that can answer it.
Yeah.
That is of us, not outside of us, but of us through us.
I wonder how functional it is for everybody as well, because, as you're talking about different sensitivities, you come into the world with different sensitivities to different, I say, like, abilities. And I really see that from this perspective as, we're one human body organism, Earth, planet. There's an Earth consciousness. It's alive, it's intelligent. I remember being in COVID in the lockdown and seeing something that was really obvious, but I just hadn't noticed before. We started growing a garden it was in Portugal. I remember just looking at the land and thinking, oh, it's alive. Like, the trees are alive because they have these different waves where this is a time for it to produce fruit, and then another wave will rise. This time to produce fruit. And we put little scraps of things in the ground, and suddenly it became food that we could eat. And it's like, this whole thing is alive. I didn't notice that, even though it's really obvious when you kind of stop for a minute and think, yeah, everything is alive. But why the hell was I talking about that? I can't remember. What were we talking about
before that? So coming into the world with certain perceptive abilities.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so certain perceptive abilities, and people as one body, for some people it might not be functional to have lucid dream capacities, because that's not their job, so to speak. It's they need to be very, very this, whereas some other people are some other part of the body. If you're an eyeball and somebody else is a fingertip, you might have a relationship, but your sensory acuity and your sense, the things that you're developed at, are going to be different. Maybe you don't want...
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right. I think, I'm very much designed to move between those worlds, I think. And you're right. It's not necessarily everyone's path to be moving between those worlds. It's just not. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah.
I find it fascinating as well. But for people who, I know with this work, for people who do move into those worlds, and it seems like we largely arrive in, we think we're not in the symbolic world, but we do project symbolism onto things unconsciously. It's just an unconscious symbolism. So being in the logical world would be, maybe there would be an example of, I see this situation and symbolically it represents this thing from my past, even though it's not the same situation. So we're constantly in that symbolic world, but as an unconscious projection.
Totally. That's a really, really good point, actually. It's a really good point. I feel like I have thoughts dropping in on this, but they're not quite formed. There's just something in it, and the way that you speak to that, when I refer back to what I was talking about on the magical thinking piece and the way that's
Mm.
kind of poo-pooed. And then there isn't an acknowledgement that actually automatically, unconsciously, we are constantly working with symbols and projecting symbolism onto things. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And that's why there's a kind of an inversion of the what it can be such a relief for people to come back to in a kind of ironic but like obviously inverted way is the real world of physical things. Like there's a certain safety when you're doing somatic exercises or working with people where it's like, okay, you're in this like mental world of symbolic projections and it's creating this intense amount of response, fight flight response, and your ability to be able to just be in the reality here and now and touch a table, touch the things around you, just notice how reassuringly mundane and boring the physical empirical world actually is. Like I'm still here, I'm still on the ground, I'm rooted somehow in that empirical reality where things are not amorphously moving around all the time. It really, I feel like so much of this stuff maps onto the yin yang symbol really well. It's like within one you will find the other. Like as you descend into the darkness, you'll find the light. As you kind of move into the light, you'll find the darkness, and it's kind of vice versa, churning thing.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else we haven't covered? I feel like we've gone for a little while now. And I have like pages and pages of notes, but it feels like we had a good run at that. So is there anything else that you've been thinking of recently or that you wanted to bring in?
There isn't anything that I'd like to add that's dropping in, though. That feels complete. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Well, where can people find your work then? And I would highly recommend it. And like, what else have you got kind of going on at the moment?
Thank you. So I'm mainly on Substack now. I'm on Substack and Instagram. You can find me on Instagram as well, but I would probably recommend primarily find me on Substack. As far as work that I've got going on, I am only working with people one-on-one. I can perhaps give you a link to the information and application for that.
Yeah,
and then also on Substack, I'm building a subscription that just allows me to come in and do like some form of teaching and transmission every week. So I don't know when this podcast is going to be shared, so I might not be doing the thing that I'm doing right now, but it doesn't really matter. Essentially on Substack, like I do a bunch of writing for free. I put a lot on there, and then I also have a paid service where I will spend anything from 6 weeks to 12 weeks exploring a specific theme and coming in weekly with writing, teaching, practices, prompts, just a kind of mixed bag multimedia curation of teaching material. It's beautiful. I love Substack. I love the way it allows me to bring together all of my favorite things. I love writing. I'm probably a writer before I am anything else. I love teaching. I love using my voice. I love working with people. So Substack is a really great place, like an entry point. And then on a higher level, like at the moment, I'm just working with people, on a one-to-one basis.
Was that the thing you had? There was the bold bitch thing. Did I get that right?
So I've just finished Bold Bitch. That was all about expression. And at the moment, I'm just about to begin something called Inside Out. Again, this has so been the theme of our discussion, has been like the internal world. My one-on-one container at the moment is called Internal. That is the frequency, and it is just about like that state of like knowing with every cell of your body that you are the source. You are the source. And then you overflow from there. Like you don't need to get anything out of life or people. There's no like push pull. It's like you're full within yourself. It doesn't mean that you don't want things and that you don't create things. It just means that you desire and you create from that overflow of being like full within you. So inside out. And it's also then about the collective piece, right? It's like, because that's beautiful. Like, first and foremost, that is like such a beautiful way to be. It's, life is so good from that place, even when it's not good, even when things are hard. Life, you just have this like baseline peace and fulfillment and even joy that exists that you can access whenever, because it's within you and it's within you, right? So there's that. And then the collective piece is what that actually then creates. Like when people en masse on when en masse, it is en masse, yeah.
Spelled with an en, I think, isn't it?
Yeah,
En masse.
en masse. When people come into that realization collectively, when more and more people realize that on a deeper and deeper level, like what we then create from there is completely different. Yeah. And that's why I talk about the political piece and the personal power piece, because those structures, I mean, it's already falling in on itself. The left-right divide is already falling in on itself because more people are actually coming to this point. So all of the work I'm doing right now is about cultivating that connection. Inside Out will be an 8-week exploration on that. I might be doing something completely different by the time this podcast comes out, but worth speaking to it, because I think as well, it's like a central thread to everything I do. It was a central thread to the piece on expression that I just finished as well. It's the core thing.
Yeah, creating from a place of fullness has a very different texture and flavor than creating from a place of lack. And it seems it's like where you create from creates more of where you create from in the world, which is why it feels so vital, like the kind of work that you're doing there. So, what a pleasure, what a privilege. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm just feel thrilled to have you on. So amazing. Yeah, thank you for your time. Thanks to everybody who's watching and listening. If you have any feedbacks or comments, I'll put the links in the descriptions to your work, and I would love to chat again at some point.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Amazing. I'll see you later. Goodbye.
Bye.